plague victims out of I'm pining for the days when we didn't have to worry about such things. Okay, so a couple things in really fast. So we're going to get through the last little bit of, what were the raids that were done? The Palmer raids and part of what scare? The first Red Scare. I know that's like 11, just one. And somebody gets to take a DBQ. You're the reason we have to wait. And, who tried to blow up this, Wall Street? Anarchists. In general. So let's do you have documents? You have a pen? Pen helps. Cursive helps too, but very few people write in cursive anymore. You know why cursive helps? You have to listen.
It's just there. We should do it. I literally forgot how to do everything that we're doing, and so I'm sitting there and that's why I got some things. I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just
Anarchists blew it up because wages did not keep up with inflation. There was a wave of what all over the United States in 1919? Yeah, strikes all over. So let's go ahead and get to one more thing that fits in with the growth of eugenics, which this always makes me uncomfortable when I remember how the National Socialists really liked the American idea of eugenics. Can I show you this map? The forced sterilization. The plan was to not let undesirables breed, whether they have some kind of mental or physical handicap, or they might be criminals. All the states that have some kind of color had sterilization, including Montana. So that started in the teens, but all the way through to the 1930s. The idea is they could selectively breed. And so, in Montana, it was less. I mean, sterilization, if you say anything over one, seems like a lot, but it was less than 50 in Montana. But nationwide, it was over 25,000. But one more thing fits in with this nativist trend, and it was a pretty racially tense, racist time, was the Great Migration, where African Americans moved from the South, fled Jim Crow and the restrictions of sharecropping, and moved north. But especially when factory jobs opened up because of the war. Waves of immigrants, and they all went to big cities, all of them. So you can really see here New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, the populations of African Americans in those cities exploded. In mostly segregated areas, here we have a New York scene. So areas that were immigrants from previous generations, like Harlem and New York, migrants moved into Harlem, which is the northern part of Manhattan. It was a pretty rugged area, so the pretty beat up area. Now it's very valuable area, of course, everything in Manhattan is. And the big thing is only big cities. Only big cities. Blacks, they couldn't go to small cities, medium-sized cities. What were those towns called I told you about earlier, where blacks would not be let in after dark? Those sundown towns, and they were all over. So blacks only could move into northern cities, and they would be arrested or lynched if they went to these small towns outside. It's no coincidence that you have blacks moving north. Oh, before we get to that, no coincidence. Okay, we're so segregated in the north. It's still not quite as bad as the South, but still, second-class citizens in a way, but still a lot more freedom, and they could vote in the north. It was different than the Jim Crow South, but it's still very segregated, very economically or economically tough for blacks in the north. Oh, and one more thing, World War II, you'll see a lot on the West Coast. There'll be another great migration during World War II. But let's jump right into this. It's no coincidence. You have immigration, war, anarchists, all the things that happen with that, all the changes in society because of technology, and the Great Migration, and the Klan is back. The Klan would make its formal reappearance in 1915, and it was mostly in northern and plain states to keep blacks out. The South, in the Western Klan, Georgia, Florida. But the big thing is they talk to themselves as true American, and they would use the word all the time, stock, which is, stock like livestock, which sound very much like eugenics. True Americans. And so they feared immigrants. They were very anti-Catholic. I didn't put that down, but I showed the cartoon. But part of this new wave of immigrants was a huge wave of Jews. So very anti-Semitic, very anti-Jew. And my nephew is Jewish. His mom's Jewish. And on his mom's side came in the wave right before the National Origins Act. Came to Chicago. On his grandfather's side, they came like in the 1880s. I just thought right before the Origins Act.
So what made them come back? Like, why did they come back?
Because of the Great Migration, blacks moving north.
So that's what they did.
Direct correlation. Direct correlation. And very anti-Catholic. So the Klan was this, true Americans were Protestant. And we'll fit in with this fundamentalism, which I'll talk about in just a second. But here's a pro-Klan cartoon from Indiana in 23. And it's a Klansman with the Holy Bible and the flag sitting on top of the, I assume it's knocked out Pope.
Okay.
Catholics can't be trusted because they'll follow the Pope and not America. And this goes back to the Reformation. It's also, there are Catholic majorities in like Italy and Eastern Europe, and it's a way to be prejudiced because Eastern European, or they're Catholic, or Irish. So it's part of that prejudice too. And here's that big Klan march in 24 in front of the Capitol. Saw the video yesterday. And it's no coincidence, it's just as the Great Migration was beginning. You have the movie I mentioned before, D.W. Griffith's Birth of the Nations, happened just as the Great Migration began. It glorified the Klan in 1913, a way to fight back against blacks moving north, immigration. 2 years later, the Klan started again. No coincidence. And you have all these Confederate monuments, including the one in Helena, all at this time. So it all relates. And a pretty amazing time. And you'll see things like this happen whenever there's a lot of economic, social disruption. We saw it in the 1840s, saw it in the 1740s. You might be seeing it now. And the best example of the reemergence of the Klan and what this meant in the Great Migration happened in Tulsa. Now, Tulsa, there was a little bit of the Great Migration, but it was a Jim Crow town, segregated black sections. There was a pretty active Klan, and in 1921, a young black man was accused of rape. Now, he was accused of rape because he was dating a white woman, therefore rape. You would be shocked how many of the lynchings were because of that reason. You'd be shocked. And the plan was it was going to be another lynching. But this time, black men there were not allowed. They surrounded the police and would not let him be drug out and be tortured to death, which was the norm. But that would trigger whites rampaging through they called it Little Africa, but it was the segregated section of Tulsa, burning and looting. And the governor of Oklahoma sent out the National Guard and had a nearby Army Air Corps base, that's what it was called then, attack. Who did they attack? The black neighborhood. They bombed the neighborhood. That was the norm. This would be one of the most violent reactions to it, but it was like a normal reaction. Of course the blacks did. And you'll see this time after time. There's a legacy on there. It's amazing. It depends where you go and who you talk to if they know about Tulsa. This is kind of a big deal. We'll see a similar thing about New York in 35 and then Boston 65. There's a history here. This is the Klan. Supposedly this is in Oklahoma. There's the closest one I can find to Tulsa, so it works. Now, but the Klan reemerged. It was back in, it'd be 23 years after this, that my grandpa would have the Klan burn a cross in his yard. They burned a cross in his yard. He chased them away with a shotgun. And my dad went for Sunday dinner there. There was just a burnt section of the yard and the shape of the cross. So they got there. No one talked about it. The Klan thought he was either a Mormon or a Jew, so they were going to run him out. And he wouldn't be run out. And it was, I think it was, you know, nobody knew where my grandpa came from, so that's why the rumor started. It just turned out he was from Ohio. But here is a lynching in Kansas City in the 20s. That's in Alabama. The NAACP started putting out this flag because nobody did anything. Nobody was arrested. Nobody would even be charged, let alone tried for lynching. Look at this one in Kansas City. It's like a party, isn't it? Almost always young black men would be tortured to death in this way. And it would not be until 1964 that the federal government would say that this could be a violation of the civil rights as a way for the federal government to do something about lynching.
What year?
64. We'll get to it, the Civil Rights Act of 64. In fact, the guy who was just elected to Jones, the senator from Alabama, just elected in Alabama, he became famous in Alabama because he brought 4 men up for murdering four black girls in Birmingham, Alabama in 1962. And he brought them up 30 years later for trial. That's how he became famous, for violating their civil rights. But the reaction by blacks, and the textbook has this in the progressive era, but I think it better fits in with the Great Migration. Because you have the disappointment because of Reconstruction. But for the most part, after Reconstruction, because of Jim Crow and sharecropping, blacks had very little voice. They couldn't be heard. But then they moved north. And that's where you begin to see a reaction. And what kind of reaction do you have? Are you going to accept it? Are you going to run away? Demand equal rights? Demand a few crumbs. And it's going to be a big divide. There's a stamp for Booker T. Washington, one of the great men of this era, former slave. But he looked at it as well-educated within the system that whites would allow through, he helped establish Negro colleges, as they were called. And what he said is, okay, we're never going to get equal rights, at least now. Quit demanding equal political rights, economic rights, and just try for better economics. There was a conference in Atlanta where where colored leaders, as they would have said, met. So it's called the Atlanta Conference, the Atlanta Declaration, where he just simply said, let's just fight for better economics. More black-owned businesses, better jobs for blacks, and we'll get this slight little economic incremental growth, and that will lead to some political change down the road. So accept Jim Crow and more just just the racism of the rest of the country, just accept it. This was seen as not only illogical, but unacceptable to many people, including this man right here, WB, everyone called him Webb. It's French, but everyone called him Du Bois because we're Americans. Be Dubois, wouldn't it? But everyone, it's always been Webb Du Bois. And I know that's incorrect, but you know. And he looked at it totally different. He would start the group that hung the flag. He would help start the group called the NAACP. Anybody know what the NAACP stands for? Yeah, colored people, exactly. National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And they would fight for more than economic rights. Much like, this kind of goes back to Langston, a little bit like Seneca Falls. You're not going to get any of these economic rights without political rights. And that means we need equal rights. So Du Bois would even go to Paris during the peace talks and demand colonies in Africa to be independent. He was a real fighter for equal rights. And the NAACP would coin that term civil rights, as we know it today. And this is the beginning of the modern civil rights movement. You really see it evolve and grow after World War II. We'll get to it. It'll make sense then why it did then. Not because they sat back and waited. It was just that situation became all right, especially with TV. And lastly, this guy, Marcus Garvey. He looked at it as we need black nationalism. Like, and this idea that we'll create something black separate from whites. Whites are going to be racist, period. Whites are racist. There's no way around it. They're never going to let us have equal rights. So we're going to have to do it on our own. So within the United States, I have more black communities, black businesses, all black owned, and even talked about, they used to say we're going to go back to Africa. It should remind you a little bit of going to Liberia. You remember the American Colonization Society. And even they started adopting some African wear. He liked to dress in military uniforms. And his movement gained a lot of power. You know, it's nationalism. You know, like a country. And one more thing, black. That's a big deal. Because black, if it wasn't white, it was seen as negative. I say, no, there's nothing negative about black. And this got great influence by the 1960s with the Black Power movement, which we'll get to in April. But this would grow until the Great Depression, and there's some corruption in Garvey, but he had a lot of power. In the 50s, you'll see it come back, and in the 60s, you'll really see the reemergence of black nationalism. A little bit outside of what Garvey is. Now, here's the thing. This is the beginning of the fight for equal rights. Which one of those three men, therefore three kind of ideas, would be more accepted by the established politicians, the established system? Which one? Booker T. Washington. He got the stamp of the 1930s. Yeah, because he didn't really want to change. Just accept what it is. Just be good workers. Just be good workers and accept it. I'm exaggerating. He didn't quite believe that. He thought he was being realistic. And Du Bois said, no, you got to fight. You got to fight or you never get what you want. And it would turn out to be much closer to what had to happen. Garvey, we'll come back to that idea a little bit later. One more thing. As so many African Americans moved north, they had a degree of cultural freedom they had never had before. So a little bit of this on the plantations, of the big plantations, where they had this kind of slave culture develop. Well, then sharecropping more spread out. And then here in urban areas like Chicago or New York in Harlem. The Harlem Renaissance was this cultural flowering of kind of this pent-up music and art and literature and poetry that just exploded in the 1920s. And so it's the beginnings of, you combine blues with jazz. Cab Calloway right here would be one of the leaders of swing music. The Cotton Club would become internationally known. That's kind of the center of this new cultural expression of not blacks. You got to get out of the North. And you see this, it's still kind of so separate from white culture, but eventually there will be a mingling of it. You'll really see it in the late 50s, mid to late 50s. And off and on through this time. Harlem now is much more diversified, but then it was almost all African Americans by 1940. And so, that is it for this. We're going to talk a little bit about the culture, but this one, I got to use the board. You excited? Because I have to draw trickle-down economics. Who's excited? So, who's been to Harlem? Harlem, in the part of Manhattan, or Harlem, Netherlands? Really? You haven't been to the Netherlands?
I wish.
It's named after Harlem, the Netherlands. Remember New York was New Amsterdam? Do you remember that? Do you remember there used to be colonies here? So I hope you guys get a review package to kind of go through all that stuff. That's a hint for you'll get a big review packet you got to do.
Okay. That's actually nice.
And it gets on the review. It's actually really helpful.
Thanks.
I'm almost too good. So with that, let's talk a little bit about, we talked about culture. That's one thing I like about the video, but a couple more things we have to get about this. The 1920s. When you look at the 20s, a couple of things are going to come out about this. And with all the changes that are going on in the world, I mean, think about 1920, what they just had in the last 30 years. You've had economic depression, you've had horrific war, and a pandemic that killed millions. You've had women demanding rights, you've had prohibition, you've had the beginnings of the Great Migration going north. You've had waves of immigrants that are coming in that are different than previous waves, more Eastern European, more Southern Europeans, a lot more Catholic and Jew instead of Protestant. You've had this huge wave combined with technology that just blew people's mind. I mean, not only electricity, but you could go to a movie and not only be taken away, but watch newsreels of things you have never seen before around the world. And in just a few years after 1920, you can get this massive, big thing you can buy with all kinds of tubes and dials and turn it on and hear live music or broadcast from New York City. Did I just blow your mind? And assembly line, cars, I mean, telephone, all these things now that average people are getting, the world is being turned upside down. So think about 1920. And there's going to be a reaction to this. And we're going to get in the 20s a conservative revival. It's conservative in a lot of different ways. So we're going to talk about this in just a second. Conservative economics, soon to be called trickle down. You're going to have conservative foreign policy, which we'll talk about more when we get to right before World War II. And that is very, at least the rhetoric is isolation. Remember, we didn't pass the Treaty of Versailles, we're not going to join the League of Nations, even though we're not completely isolationists. It's not like we put a wall over like Japan in 1700. And the biggie is this cultural conservatism right here. And cultural conservatism is going to become a major political force in the United States. You're going to see another example of this that's even going to be bigger in the late 1970s. A cultural conservative wave. And they're all use the word conservative. It doesn't mean if you're conservative economically, you believe in these two. Have this cultural conservatism. And there's elements that people have. But this will become such a powerful force. We see it in the 1920s. And the Democrats got much more conservative, but this is mostly Republican. This is a Republican movement, a Republican-controlled decade. Most states, houses, and governorships will be Republican, including Montana. Most, Congress will be controlled by Republicans, the president Republican, and a Republican Supreme Court. Not overwhelming, but it was still Republican and very culturally conservative. And a couple things about this. All this change going on, and conservatism is an idea to do what? Well, not quite. This new world, all these changes, think about too, all these new scientific discoveries and new philosophy. New art, abstract art just made its big appearance. Let's go back to when life was better. Let's go back to where life was stable. We knew exactly what was expected of us. Let's go back to the way, not the way it was. The way, let's go back to the way it should have been. So the 1920s, they're not thinking, let's go back to 1898. Because they used to talk about the 1890s. That was when they go back. They called it the gay 90s. Let's go back to the 90s where life was good. Because the 90s were tough. A horrible panic, Coxey's army, the Pullman strike, there's going to be a war. It was not the way the 90s were. It was the way we will take elements of it, and it's the way it should have been. It's the way we look back in the 90s as the 1890s is a myth. You'll see the same things in the 1930s and 1940s. The 20s were this great time, this crazy time. They said the same thing in the 1950s. In the 1970s, especially late 1970s, when you have horrific inflation running at 20% and things like that, people are looking back to the 50s. They have the most popular television show in the 1970s. That was a very popular movie. The popular television show was a show called Happy Days. One of the most popular movies was a show called American Graffiti. And then like shows, spin-offs of all these other 50s shows would come about. People started dressing what they thought of 50s fashion. It wasn't that they really knew about what life was like in 1957. It was their myth, their kind of vision. Wasn't it grand then? Where people, we didn't have people around the disruption of the 60s. We didn't have the disruption of the civil rights movement. Women knew their place. That was a big element of that in the 70s. You see the same thing here. Oh, thank goodness that suffrage thing is done. Now women can go back and be what they're supposed to be, like they were in the 1890s. We don't have to worry about all these different people coming here that seem different with different cultures, different religion, and they all seem to be radicals. Or for that matter, before the migration happened. Let's go back. And the big thing about this myth, it is very much a romantic idea. Don't think of romantic love. Think of romantic as this idealized version of the way it was. And it's a hierarchy. We want to go back to where people knew who was in charge. One thing that was said a lot, we want to go back to when people knew their place. You knew your place, and you didn't complain, and you just did what you were told, unless maybe you were on top. Go back to that way. I can't emphasize what a big deal it was about women. Women in the 1920s, especially after World War I, they started dressing differently, started smoking in public, started going to speakeasies, which were illegal bars. But women didn't go to bars before the 1920s, unless they were professionals. Sex workers, essentially. That just didn't happen. And now the 20s, we got to get them back to where women are supposed to be. And what are women supposed to be? What's the cult? And by the way, that's a myth too. But still, let's go back to that myth, because we like that myth better. We see the same thing in the 1970s. That's why women don't like equal rights to this day, because that myth overtook. And so, legally, equal rights. So, people knew their place. It's a big deal. And that's what you're going to get at the same time. A similar thing happened during the 1840s, happened in the 1740s with the First and Second Great Awakening. You have the growth of, this term came about in the teens of the 20th century, called fundamentalism. Very Protestant, and to try to go back to the roots. They would say old-time religion a lot. Now, old-time religion was actually going back to the Second Great Awakening. It wasn't going back to any time before the 1840s. And you're going to see these religious revivals and the growth of different religious sects, really a bunch of what's going to be considered cults develop in this era, especially and then into the 1930s. Let's go back, and so let's get away from all this science and changes and people not knowing the way things are supposed to be, and we'll get back to where we used to have, and they would say things that this was a big one. We had good values, and we had morality. So don't you have this? We have this weird contradiction of the 20s with the speakeasies and dancer, about you do the Charleston and all this stuff, and at the same time you have the growth of fundamentalism. You have this real fight, cultural fight within the United States. It's no coincidence that you have the Scopes monkey trial. It's no coincidence. And what was the issue in the Scopes monkey trial? Yeah, which of course, monkey. Because fundamentalists made it very clear, we don't evolve, I didn't evolve from no monkey. Now, of course, that's not at all what natural selection is, but remember, we're talking now about a cultural argument. It's a big deal. This really had great effect. and you'll see it in the politics. You see it in the politics, and I would argue, I know in my lifetime happened in the 70s and 90s, and we have elements of this now. It's a real cultural fight here. I know, we live in this amazing cosmopolitan town like Helena. So we just see so much going on, it's hard to keep track of everything. But we have a real cultural fight now. By the way, don't forget, 94 bucks? Yes. 20 seconds, so the Thursday before spring break. Yeah.
Was all this like bipartisan? Like, was it always like, or did it typically follow like Democrats believe this and?
No, it was very bipartisan.
Yeah.
A lot of Democrats and a lot of Republicans, especially because the South, they're only Democrats because the Republicans weren't allowed. So today it seems to be a little bit more partisan, but back then it didn't have quite happen that way. But elected officials, they're Republicans, but there's a whole lot of conservative Democrats. And so politically, we really see this. Cultural shifts affect election. It's incredible how many people vote on cultural issues. I'm just saying that because to me personally, I find it incredible. To a lot of other people, that's naturally what you vote for. So that's my own personal bias. I'm just letting you know. I vote on height. That's what I look at. Not tall or short. I mean, I just find, I just have a certain narrow ranges of heights. So with that, no, you know how many people vote on issues like very, very cultural issues like abortion or gun control, things like that. And that's very cultural. That's a cultural issue. So 1920 election. The Republican Warren G. Harding, this is where Franklin Roosevelt would lose as vice president. Harding would win pretty big. And we just had years of progressive presidents. In fact, the last two of the progressive amendments, the 18th and 19th. What did the 18th do? What did the 19th? Yeah. Suffrage. So, Harding, his slogan, this should tell you everything you need to know. Return to normalcy. What does that even mean? I guess normalcy means, to me, be like me. That's normal. And if you're not like me, you're abnormal. Correct? You hate America. But think about how many times this could happen in the past. Normalcy, he did not make it up. I remember my history teacher telling me that. Because it was going on while I was in high school. But no, this is actually a word. But think about, late 1970s, you had the same kind of cultural issues going on. And Ronald Reagan's slogan was, let's make America great again. Same kind of thing. And then Trump redid it, just took the word let's out. Same kind of idea, isn't it? Let's go back to when it was better. And by the way, when we say let's go back to when it was better, can't we all just say, yeah, we were better, right? When? We all can say a different date there, couldn't we? So, return to normalcy. And the big thing about his, he kind of personified this idea of one very important thing I kind of forgot to say. So put this, I'm sorry. The emphasis on the individual. Excuse me. The individual. Individual. And this kind of fits in. Remember this goes way back. Remember the heady days of October? The free labor idea. That you sink or swim on your own. You make it or break it on your own. This idea of individual accomplishment. And nobody helped me. There's going to be like this cult almost of Henry Ford in the 1920s. Which it would all blow up in 1931. Wow, did it ever. But this idea of individual. And this, back in the 1890s, there was also like this kind of go back to the cowboys. And the first popular movies were Westerns. In fact, they would be Westerns, which are these kind of weird myths of the plains. They've been the most popular movies up to the 1960s. And the first most popular TV shows. In fact, in the teens and the 20s, all these dude ranches appeared. That's where the term dude comes from. And dude is a city slicker, someone from the city who wants to act like a cowboy. So they go to these ranches and they wear chaps and a cowboy hat and ride a horse and they can act like a cowboy. And that was kind of an insult. You're a dude. And it's funny now that everyone calls each other dude. And every once in a while I'll baffle somebody and say, am I wearing chaps? And they just look at me like I'm crazy. But, so Harding really fit this individual idea. We're no longer going to have this kind of good government idea. The progressives, government, we're just going to let people do whatever they can, sink or swim on their own. But you can imagine what's going to happen. A lot of time when you have a government philosophy like that, the people who won't be in government will think that way too. I'm going to get what I can while I'm in government. And this administration will be known for graft. What was the most famous? Do you remember that dome?
Was this Mobilier?
Credit Mobilier is another example of that with Grant.
Is that graft?
Yeah, that's graft. This is the Teapot Dome. And here is where Harding, Secretary of the Interior, tried to sell out all the U.S. naval oil reserves, then take a big kickback.
What was he Secretary?
Interior. His name was Albert Fall. There's a big mountain, well, not that big of a mountain, but a mountain in Wyoming that looks vaguely like a teapot. That's a Teapot Dome. But it has a bunch of caves in it. So they fill those caves up with oil, with the idea of it being we always have this strategic oil reserve we can tap time of war. Well, it's all pumped out, so he just sold it and took a big kickback. But there were other examples. I mean, the Harding administration, you have all these government officials using their position to get big loans, to get business deals, to get real estate deals. It was pure graft. Because you gotta know, if you have connections to the highest levels of government, you can really leverage that for a lot of money. You know, hey, I talk to the president every day. You want to talk to the president? Let's make a deal. That's actually an issue right now. Some of you might know. You know? There's reports that the president's son-in-law leveraged his position to get about $500 million in loans from 2 places. $500 million. I mean, I know what you're saying. That's like a day's pay, but that's actually huge. That's huge. That just came out this week. But big deal. All this came out in the open right after Harding died of a heart attack. So Harding was just considered to be kind of a clown, just kind of an affable guy, but his reputation would go down afterwards. He's one of the worst presidents. Most of the time he spent rarely working. He played poker, drank a lot. Yes, prohibition was going on. And had many mistresses, including one, as I understand it. He kept her, I swear to you, this is supposedly the truth, in the closet of the executive convention, so we could bring her out when his wife was home.
She just lived in the closet.
Well, I don't know if it was always in the closet, but like she'd be in the closet. Now, I guess it was a big closet. Yeah, probably was for them. But still, it's a closet. And have one child.
With her.
Yeah. And his own kids with his wife. But, by the way, this was the return to normalcy. You would get back when better values. Hey, this might surprise you. Politicians might actually say something, but they might actually not have those same values, but they know that's what people want to hear.
Really? People would do that?
Grab your desk. Did I blow you away? So, a couple of things are really fast now. So in 23, and he'd be re-elected in 24, Calvin Coolidge. And I've told you some Coolidge stories when we watched the movie. And so we'll come back to Coolidge's economic policy in just a second. He worked a solid 1 to 2 hour work days. He became president in 23, elected in 24. He could have ran again in 28. He was incredibly popular. Now, there was an economic ticking time bomb going on, but fortunately it was underground for Coolidge, so he left with a pretty good reputation. Not for his successor. Republican, and of course, 28, the Republican Hubert Heaver. And Heaver, I mean, think about it. The individual story is incredible. Literally from an orphanage to millionaire engineer, head of the Food Administration, head of the American Red Cross, head or Secretary of Commerce, Hard to find a better resume than Hoover. And unlike Coolidge, who worked a solid 1 to 2 hour working day, Hoover seemed to be much more energetic, so perfect for this position, even though he's the same basic economic idea. But to give you the idea of the split, he ran against Al Smith, former mayor of New York City, governor of New York. And what religion was Smith? Somebody said it. He's Catholic. There was intense anti-Catholic bias, but it's more than that. Think about turning the radio on and hearing a presidential candidate for the first time. So, 1928, first time, a lot of speeches live by candidates. So this is all brand new. So imagine you live in a small town in, let's say, Montana or Illinois or wherever. And now think about the 20s, the prohibition and everything going on. And then this is the man who wants to be president. Let's listen to his voice. Now this is the narrator's little tape I have, but then just listen.
His voice also have been a factor to voters outside of the Northeast.
Here.
Now let's look at the record.
Al Smith.
Prohibition has found a new line of endeavor for the underworld. They brought life to the
He's
bootleggers,
talking about prohibition.
and the bootleggers begot the hijackers, and the hijackers begot the racketeers. My friends in the radio audience, the only cure for the ills of democracy is more democracy.
Now, what does he sound like? Yeah, and he sounds like someone who smoked, which he did, about 50 cigarettes a day. Let me say, cigars. Let's see this. What's he sound like? Think about 1920s. He sounds like a gangster, doesn't he? He sounds like everybody's vision of a gangster. Think how important your image of a voice is.
How does this?
A 1920s gangster? Yeah.
This is 1920s.
Yeah, and see, that's the thing. I think about 1920s. So he sounds like what everyone thought of Al Capone.
He's judged for his voice.
Don't people judge on first impressions all the time? What they look like, what they sound like, eye on heights? Right? So think about that for a second. You hear that like, I'm gonna like Al Capone president? You would. And here's the thing. Think how important image. You remember talking about image becoming more important. Now we can hear them. Wow. Think about what you combine that with seeing them. How much image is going to matter. And it doesn't mean you have to sound great or have a pure voice, but it means more and more you have to play a character. You have to be somebody. The next person who would win the presidency, the next election in 32, I'd say one of the greatest voices ever in politics. You'll hear him. Franklin Roosevelt was unreal what he sounded like. Exactly what people wanted. Didn't mean he was good or bad. But boy, it helps, doesn't it? So, we have Hoover. Now, one thing that tied Hoover, Coolidge, and Harding, one man. They each had the same Secretary of the Treasury. The same Secretary of the Treasury. Andrew Mellon, of the Pennsylvania Mellons. I put Mellons. Okay, he inherited a huge fortune. His family got rich on coal, and the big one was kerosene. Once kerosene became big in the 1860s, their family got huge. Oil. The Mellon family are still just unbelievably rich. So he's inherited wealth, very wealthy, worth hundreds of millions of dollars in the 1920s. So we're talking billions today. And Mellon's the Secretary of the Treasury. And his economic program would personify Republican economics of this era and conservative economics to this day. And it goes back to what Alexander Hamilton wanted. It goes back to that laissez-faire economics of the Whigs. And it's conservative economics. He called it trickle down. Okay, that's not even, got the K. Trickle down economics. And the idea was this: government, which has an immense influence on the economy. Remember, governments print the money, give the money wealth, give the money wealth. They make the rules, they enforce the rules, they protect the market. And governments have a immense impact on the economy. There can be no market without government. If you don't believe me, go set up a shop in Mogadishu, Somalia. Tell me how things go. So you need a government. By the way, how does government give money and value? Huh? On the right track. Even before that, tax. I'm going to collect dollars, so nothing else. But last thing I'm going to get to this. We're trickle-down economics. So what we got to do is we got to write these three things down. First off, what we want to do is help the wealthy. The wealthy create prosperity. If the wealthy have more money, they will produce more, they will make more business, and it will filter down to everybody else. In fact, their argument is, excuse me, why would you give money to someone who's poor? Give money to somebody who has wealth they know what to do with. And so we're going to make a little chart here with a dollar sign, and quickly tomorrow we'll finish the chart of trickle-down economics. I will show you exactly how trickle-down economics work. I'm going to draw you a chart that for some of you will change your life. Actually, it's very concise, good little economic chart. If you're confused about, I'll give you a good Keynesian economic one too. If you're confused about macroeconomics, I will help you immensely. Wear your shirts again tomorrow if it's more economics.
What?
I told you. Wear your shirt tomorrow if it's more economics.
Are you gonna videotape tomorrow?
I'll do what I want. Anything else?
Oh, that was sassy.
What is that homework
You
say?
Remind me to videotape tomorrow.
You? 23?
Look at my wrist. I'm guessing.
So what do we do?
What do we
I
do?
felt like I had my thoughts. Oh, there's the book.
It sounds a problem. It becomes right.
Oh, like, where do I go with this? And I skip me.
Library. Okay, this is what we're going to do. Tomorrow, in class, we're going to figure out the job line. Sound good? Just remind me, right? I'll just say all of them. Do you need this? Well, you got these comments for this.
Well, there's a spout, so I went to.
And if anyone asks, I'll say that you were skipping and breaking stuff. Library, Victor. Hey, you want to hear Al Smith again?
Who?
I think I played this for you last year. Al Smith ran for president in 28.
Could his voice also have been a factor to voters outside of the Northeast?
Here.
Now let's look at the record. Prohibition has found a new line of endeavor for the underworld.
I mean,
They brought life to the bootleggers,
how much?
and the bootleggers begot the hijackers, and the hijackers begot the racketeers.
A decent victory for
My friends in the radio audience, the only cure for the end of democracy is more democracy.
Yet the advent of radio meant
That's.
I got this great tape from the National Archives. This is, I mean, we're talking 25 years ago. But it had all these recordings of various people. But it was an old cassette tape.
Oh.
And the tape literally fell apart. It was falling apart, but I was able to save this little bit.
It was worth it.
Well, it had Teddy Roosevelt, but the Teddy Roosevelt I played in class, and for some reason the tape crinkled. And Teddy Roosevelt had this high, squeaky voice.
Really?
Yeah, it's really funny. Because what do you think of Teddy Roosevelt? You think of this kind of...
Yeah, I would not think of like a Mickey Mouse level. Of
No, you think of this masculine Teddy Roosevelt boxing in the basement of the White House voice. Excellent. It's a good story. I do.
I haven't educated myself compulsively.
It's an incredible story. But they do, you know, like,
Don't is on.
yeah, just turn one on. It's too bright up there too. Like Heaven's Gate and a few of this. There's a big cult that was near Garrison, Montana, called the Church Universal in Triumph.